Mr. Speaker, I rise today to unequivocally condemn in the strongest possible terms the actions of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Just last week, referring to her obstruction of bipartisan targeted relief bills that we could have voted on this floor, she said, quote, "Don't characterize what we did before as a mistake. This was not a mistake, it was a decision," end quote. When asked what had changed, why she is finally coming to the table on COVID relief, her response was simple: a new president. We've known for months that Speaker Pelosi was holding the American people hostage for political gain. I've said it, my colleagues have said it. While Americans suffered under unscientific, foolish lockdowns, Pelosi withheld relief for political purposes. Not policy purposes, but political purposes. But we now have a full admission. She said the quiet part out loud. This was never about what was best for the American people, never about honest policy disagreement. It was about preventing President Trump from getting any credit. It was about politics. Speaker Pelosi made a simple calculation. She bet that if she could keep Congress from reaching a deal on COVID relief, that would hurt President Trump and Republicans and give her more power. Even when members of her own party asked her to bring common sense, standalone, bipartisan relief measures to the House floor that would easily become law, she refused. She would say over and over again that nothing is better than something. And she was being honest. She honestly believed that nothing was better than something, but better for who? Not for the American people, that's for sure. She believed that nothing was better than something for her and her party. It's hard to imagine a more awful and heartless strategy. And what's worse, Speaker Pelosi does all of this while people in her home state suffer from unscientific, unconstitutional lockdowns the Democrat leaders in California are forcing upon their citizens. These lockdowns are not based in science. They never have been. Study after study shows that they yield little, if any, benefits, but they impose extreme costs on the small businesses suffering under them. You know what else? The Democrat leaders making these executive orders, they know this too, because they're violating their own guidelines. The Speaker of the House couldn't even let a pesky little lockdown get in the way of a haircut appointment, even though those same lockdowns destroy the lives of her constituents. We've all seen the heartbreaking video of Angela Marsden, the owner of Pineapple Hill Saloon and Grill in Los Angeles. Everyone should have to watch that testimony as Democrats shut down her outdoor dining while a Hollywood studio sets up shop right next door. She represents millions of Americans suffering who have taken note of the hypocrisy of these lockdowns, of the double standards, as big businesses can operate freely while small businesses are shamed into submission and told wrongly that they are the ones who must sacrifice to slow the spread, that the demise of the business they spent their whole lives building is the price to pay because if it just saves one life. But this is unscientific nonsense. And we all know it. Study after study shows outdoor dining is safe, that outbreaks are not occurring because of our small businesses, our gyms, our restaurants, our salons. And yet these small businesses are in the crosshairs of cowardly politicians across the country. This madness has to stop. This arbitrary application of executive orders is deeply, deeply unconstitutional. Justice Gorsuch recently stated, "There is no world in which the Constitution tolerates color-coded executive edicts that reopen liquor stores and bike shops, but shutter churches, synagogues, and mosques." Americans have had enough. It is time to stand up against the hypocrisy of these so-called leaders deliberately harming the citizens they claim to represent, and to condemn the deeply partisan actions of the Speaker of this House.
I want to talk about what lowers costs for Americans and how to build that infrastructure that does so, because we keep hearing that the Build Back Better plan, the infrastructure plan that was passed, will lower costs for Americans. This is repeated so often that it supposedly becomes self-evident. We have to ask how, because this argument is based on the notion that spending more federal money actually makes these projects easier to execute. Somebody has to ask, is that actually true? Now, you could argue that better infrastructure certainly lowers costs, but the infrastructure has to be built. It actually has to happen. And as Americans are experiencing the highest cost of electricity in the last 20 years, I want to know how the Build Back Better agenda will actually reduce costs, not just by spending money, but by making projects easier to complete. Mr. Hergott, we'll start with you, please, and thank you for being here. During your time at the permitting office, what did you find was the single largest threat to getting a project completed?
Well, I think, thank you for that question, Mr. Crenshaw. I think that there's a bit of a disconnect between the world that everyone wants to live in and the one that we actually live in. And the one that I live in and in the Trump administration in particular, and although it was little known, we pushed some of the largest wind and solar projects in the history of our country, right? And some of the largest in the world, even though it got me in a bit of trouble. But the reality is that it takes 7 to 10 years for a project that starts today. What do we do in that 10-year period, especially now that we have supply chain issues that we can't actually address? So at the same time that we're talking about demand and supply issues and a recognition of where that might increase prices, at some point, if you're going to you can't throw good money after bad. At some point, we have to have a roadmap, whether it's wind, solar, transmission. My entity is agnostic. But the bottom line is, if people are putting capital at risk on whatever energy source that comports with the stated national policy and the changing priorities of the whims of elections, we have to remove this, because those 20 to 30% of costs are things that we have to solve and that are not going to solve themselves. And apparently nobody wants to talk about it in a real way. And those kinds of costs are the ones that are borne on utility bills. And those are the things that I haven't seen addressed by either side, either in the draft versions of the infrastructure bill or in the current Build Back Better plan. Creating a new office within an agency doesn't solve a problem. All right, yeah. Calling something shovel ready without making it shovel ready doesn't do anything for the American people.
Right, and that does get to a question I was going to ask about the claim that the infrastructure bill took care of these process issues, but you're saying it does not.
Well, while I was in the administration, I drafted something called One Federal Decision in a recognition that we needed to bring this disparate universe of decision makers and have one adult in the room that would actually drive the process. No shortcuts to the environmental reviews, but that there would actually be not necessarily yes, but a decision given in a reasonable amount of time. One Federal Decision was codified in the most recently passed bill, but that's only for DOT projects. The Federal Permitting Council, of which I ran, which is an extremely successful tool, and Christina Rada, who currently runs it, is exceptional at her job. Problem is that it only has 8 projects, 6 wind and 1 transmission, and it's only for projects that are $200 million and above. Those are very targeted, narrow tools. What do you do with the other 2,000 projects that are stated to meet the 2030 climate goals that are sitting in a period of limbo with no one giving them a hand? And those are both our faults. Right.
Last thing I want you to talk about is how our court system is weaponized, and what we could do to streamline the process, which would avoid that.
So thank you for that question. There's currently about 1,200 cases that are a direct contributor to a renewable energy future that are currently in active stages of litigation, whether that was the most recent rescission of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act that makes it now a criminal penalty to have an incidental take of even one bird, has paralyzed offshore wind development and wind development in Nevada. And solar is the same issue, is being impacted by new changes to the sage grouse. Not even just the NEPA rules that everyone talks about. It's the 60 other permits that are required here that have now created an uncertain regulatory landscape.